So this morning, we are going to start our series on Jonah. And we're going to be going back and forth because we're going to be in Jonah this week. Lord willing, we're going to be in Jonah next week. And then we're taking a week off because we have a special speaker. Phil Nordine is going to be here. And he's going to bring the word. And it's going to be great. And then we'll be back probably in Jonah because I suspect it's going to take us a couple weeks at least to go through Jonah because there's a lot of great stuff. But this morning, I want to just kind of paint some overall pictures, some details, connect some dots, just kind of start to wrestle a little bit with the book of Jonah because there's so much stuff in there just to kind of set the stage. And yet, even as we do that, there's some powerful, I think, messages, some powerful challenges that the Lord has for us. So we'll be in and out of Jonah a little bit today. And then starting next week, we're going to start to really jump into the chapters and take it apart because there's some really incredible messages in the book of Jonah. And then as a part of it, I think we're going to have a movie night and watch the movie Jonah by Sound and Sight and Sound Theater, and you won't want to miss that. So I think we're going to have lots of fun with Jonah because it's a message. You know, Jonah is one of the most known stories by everybody. If you stop somebody on the street and say, hey, do you know the story of Jonah? Most people will go, yeah, isn't that about a guy and a whale and swallowing or something? And they'll have seen something about Jonah. Most people know the story that Jonah and a whale or a fish or a sea monster or something, and they know some details. But Jonah is actually a strange book for a prophet. It's referenced as a minor prophet, and yet it's a very unique book because you see, Jonah is actually more of a history book than a prophetic book because there is actually only 5 if you're reading Hebrew, words of prophecy in the entire book. You know, when we go to Jeremiah, which is the longest book of prophecy in the Bible, it's full of stuff. Did you know the book of Jeremiah is the longest book in the Bible? It's actually longer than Psalms, and it has more words, and it gives the heart of God. And yet in Jonah, we're going to see God's heart beats in the story. And unless you think that Jonah's his only prophecy was related to Nineveh, if you go in your Bibles to 2 Kings 14, we see that Jonah is actually referenced. So if you've gone to Jonah, keep your finger in Jonah. If you go to 2 Kings verse 14, you're going to find a verse that says this: Jeroboam the second recovered the territories of Israel, and then it describes where he recovered them, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had promised through Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet from Gath-hepher. So Jonah was a prophet. He was used by God. He spoke to the king. He's not just, because one of the things that you run into is people start to look at Jonah and go, well, it's a great story. Maybe it's just a story. How does it relate to the Bible? Or people trying to explain it away, and because there is some elements in Jonah where we kind of go, that's really far out. I mean, the thought of somebody being thrown overboard and swallowed by a whale, swimming and spitting and showing up on shore, we kind of go, that maybe it's just a parallel, or maybe it's just, a story for us to understand God. But Jonah actually was a prophet. He is quoted in 2 Kings. He did have a place. He did have a message, and the king heard the message, acted on it, and God moved. So he was not just this guy going through life. He was a legit prophet. He was a contemporary. He was there at the same time as some of Amos and some of the other prophets. So he would have been connected. He would have been a man of God. He would have been used by God. He would have heard the word of God, and it was true. So he was justified. He wasn't just, this crazy guy that was running along. How many have seen the VeggieTale version of it? I mean, we can be honest. A lot of us have seen VeggieTales, and that's not wrong, but we've seen different stories. I remember as a camper, as at camp, we had to come up with these themes. And one of our favorites was to decorate the cabin as a whale. And in Jonah, because we could do it. It was just kind of fun. And so that's the story. Now, how many know where Nineveh was? Nineveh is actually a legit place. It has a different name now. And also, this is another statement. Unlike the other prophets, Jonah was not sent to the people of Israel. He was sent to the Gentiles. Unique again in all the way, because all the other prophets were to God's people with a message for God's people. Jonah was not sent to God's people. He had given a prophecy. He was sent to the Ninevites. Now, the Ninevites were not like the Israelites. We know where the city was, and I have a map just to place it. And you're going, where's Nineveh? Well, Nineveh is the present-day city of Mosul. I don't think I pronounced that right, in Iraq. And that's where it was, and that's where God called him to go. It was referenced as the great city. It was actually comprised of about 4 towns that made up of about 1 million people. The wall of the city was about 60 miles around. Nineveh was the oldest, most populous city of the ancient Assyrian Empire, and it was situated on the east banks of the Tigris River, and it is where the current city is Mosul. Anyways, you know what I'm talking about. That is where it was. The walls were so broad that it took 3 days to march around the city, and they could race 3 chariots side by side on the top of the wall. That's how wide and thick the walls were. They were 100 feet tall, and the city was fortified with some 1,500 towers that were 200 feet high. It was quite a spectacular city. And within these walls, there was 1 million people that weren't just people, but there was gardens, there was cattle, there was pastures. It was full of life. And that's where God called him to go. God called him to leave the safety relative. I laugh at this statement, okay? God calls him to leave the relative safety of Israel. Now, if you've read the history, you know that prophets in Israel was not a good occupation. You know, as a parent, I don't think I would want any of my children to have been a historical prophet in old history Israel, because they stoned them. Elijah was good. He called down fire on the people when they came to oppose him. But most of the prophets did not do well. It was not one of those occupations where, you were going to get honor. Generally not. Because generally, all the prophets, and even the prophet Nathan, who prophesied to King David, who was a man after God's own heart, had to confront the king. And I was reading in Proverbs here the other day, and something about when you bring bad news to the king, it's not a good thing. In fact, the way it says is, in the smile of the king there is life. And it takes on a new meaning when you realize that if the king so much as frowns or looks bad upon you, they may kill you. And God calls you as a prophet to bring a message to them. So that was a situation, but God calls Jonah out of the relative safety to Nineveh. To go to Nineveh. And that is what we know eventually he did. So we could say that Jonah was God's foreign missionary, of the Old Testament. He is proof that even though God chose Israel, he had a heart and a desire for the Gentiles. If you go through the Bible, you realize that even as God selects Israel, and even as he selects Abraham as his prized, his special possession, his special people, he was always doing it because he wanted to use them to show himself to the nations. The problem all the way through the Bible is that Israel took what God gave them, and they grabbed it and they hid it. They did literally what Jesus says not to do. They hid their light under a barrel because they didn't want, and you understand why they did it, because the Israelites were called to be a holy, which is set apart people. called to be different. They were called to not mix with the people. But if you read all the laws in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, you understand that God always had a framework where the other people could come to them and become like them and worship God. The problem was the people wanted to protect from becoming like the other nations, so they kept the other people out from coming and becoming like them. And so you see this all the way through Israel, where Israel takes the message and holds it close. And we still do the same thing today. We still take Jesus and go, Jesus is the best thing in my life, so I'm going to protect it, because that's what we do. When we have a prized possession, what do? We go lock it in a safety deposit box. We lock it away so that nobody else can steal it. The problem is nobody can see it either, because we're afraid that if we display the valuable thing, something might happen to it. And then the result is we still do the same with Jesus. And in this message of Jonah, we see God taking his prophet and sending him to the nations. Jonah is one of the minor prophets. As we said, it's only 4 chapters long. Obadiah, the book before Jonah, is only 1 chapter long, and it's actually the shortest book in the Old Testament. And it's not really that big. But Jonah is different because he only has a short phrase. The word of the Lord came to Jonah. So it's a prophetic message, but there's only 8 words where God gives him a small message. But it reveals God's heart for all people throughout. If you read through the book of Jonah, you'll find a number of things. You find that they're always running. You see Jonah's running from God in chapter 1. Chapter 2, we see Jonah running to God because he's in the whale and he has to. Now, chapter 3, we see God running for God. And then chapter 4, we see him running ahead of God. Jonah is running. He's got to be the most fit guy in the Bible. He's either running from God, he's running with God, or he's running for God, or he's running away from God, or he's running ahead of God. And in all of those, we have powerful messages that we'll wrestle with on another day. But as I said today, we're going to paint some broad pictures this morning. One of the first things we see if we were to read through Jonah, and I challenge you to go and sit down and read through the whole book of Jonah. It's good to read it in chapters, but just sit down. It's only, that's the whole thing. Sit down and read the whole story. Get the whole picture. And one of the things you start to see is that God is concerned with and cares for all people. I'm going to read that again. God is concerned with and cares about all people. God never changes. He's still concerned about all people. And that means all people. I, for one, would love to erase some people from that God's concerned about. Can I be honest? I'm human. There's a few people where I'm like, I'm okay with God. But God says, no, I'm concerned about all people. I care about all people. We could add into that, I sent my son for all people. Not just his chosen ones. Not just the ones that claim to be his followers. We're going to leave that and we'll revisit it again, I'm sure. It suffice to say that Jonah was taken by surprise by God. Can you imagine Jonah's reaction as he finally gets a revelation from God? God finally comes down. One of the things about a prophet is you have to hear from God. And he had heard from God, and all of a sudden now he has another revelation from God, and God comes down, and maybe he said Jonah, or maybe he just knew. We don't know how he got his revelation. It doesn't tell us, but if we imagine it, we say Jonah, and we hear the voice of God saying, Jonah, are you there? And he responds, as in a true prophet, yes, God, what do you have? And he says, I'm calling to be a prophet. And I can just imagine Jonah going, wow, I'm so humbled. God has called me to be his messenger. I can't wait to bring his message to his people. This is going to be good. And he gets out his pen and his paper. And he says, where do you want me to go? Which king in Israel? Israel, or maybe you want me to go to Judah, or maybe you want me, who do you want to go? And God says, no, I want you to go to Nineveh. I'm sorry, God, but I'm called to your chosen people. And God says, no, I want you to go to Nineveh. Now, Jonah isn't very excited, and it's perfectly understand. If you understand the people of Nineveh. Nineveh was not very pretty. Because Nineveh is still around, they find posters they find statues and things that display the people of Nineveh and what they were like. And one of the things they did is, you see throughout history, they were conquering people. And they were cruel people. When they conquered a people, they would simply make the people disappear. They believed in eradicating them. They would make them slaves. They would bring them. They would do things. There's one monument that shows onlookers gloating as a man as his tongue is physically torn out of his mouth. And I can think, if you're Jonah, you're aware of this. You're like, man, I'm going to go speak. Yeah, I don't think this is a good idea, God. Or there's another one where history records they would take men, stake them out, and fillet them alive and hang their skins on their wall. These are the kind of people that he's being called to. And it gets grosser, and I'm not going to read it. They were not the nice people. So we can't really blame Jonah for not wanting to go. We can understand if he would be afraid, but I don't think Jonah was afraid. I don't think it's a lack of courage, because you see throughout the story of Jonah exhibiting great courage, whether it was like, throw me overboard, or, he was not a man that lacked courage. I think the reason he left and he went to Tarsus, and that's in chapter 1 and 2, the reason he ran from God is because he was prejudiced. And you say, well, what am I talking about? Well, it has been suggested as a Jew, he hated the Gentiles. But wait a minute. He sailed on a ship. He sailed on a ship to more Gentiles. Because Tarsus, we'll see in a map in a moment, is in Spain, probably. So he didn't hate the Gentiles, he just didn't want to go to Nineveh. What's more, he surrendered himself to save the Gentiles on the ship. He didn't have to. He says, throw me overboard. I'm running from God, and you'll be saved. You could say he was proud, and yet you see him humble as he lays down his reputation. So I don't think he was humbled. I believe he was prejudiced, and here's why. Jonah has his reasons for not wanting to go, and he states them clearly in Jonah chapter 4, verse 2, when he says this. He says, so he complained to God about it, and that's a whole nother story, complaining to God. But he says, didn't I say before I left home that you would do this, Lord? That is why I went away from Tarsus. I knew that you're a merciful and compassionate God, slow to get angry and filled with unfailing love. You were eager to turn back from destroying people. There's his reason. You see, here's what he knew that we sometimes forget. Jonah knew, as a contemporary of Amos and Hosea and the other prophets, that Israel was going to be invaded by the Assyrians. Although he never says it, at least not in writing, he would have known it, because Amos chapter 3 verse 7 says, indeed the sovereign Lord never does anything until he reveals his plans to his prophets, the servant. And he was a prophet. And Micah, here's what it says in Micah chapter 5, verse 5. And he will be the source of peace. When the Assyrians invade our land and break through our defenses, we will appoint 7 rulers to watch over 8 princes to lead us. They will rule Assyria with drawn swords and enter the gates of Nimrod. He will rescue us from the Assyrians when they pour over the borders to invade our land. That's just one verse. The Bible is very clear. God's warning was very clear to Israel that one day the Assyrians would conquer Israel. Not only that, but he knew God would be gracious, a gracious God, merciful and slow. He understood that God's will for Israel. He understood and he knew her future. He knew that God was slow to anger, and so he put all the bits together. He put all the pieces together, so to speak. And he came to this realization. If Nineveh was destroyed, Israel would be saved. But if Nineveh was saved, then Israel would be taken captive. You see, he understood that, and he loved his people, Israel. And so because of that, he resigned the ministry, and he took off on a boat on a tour. He says, God, I don't really want to be a part of this, because if I'm faithful and you're faithful, my people will be destroyed. He started to play God, and he went in the opposite direction. Not only that, but you might notice that Jonah runs a lot, and he goes down a lot. He goes down to Joppa, he gets on a boat, he goes down into the boat, and he goes to sleep. It's suffice to say that Nineveh was the one place Jonah didn't want to go. So Jonah decided to run away. He went as far away from Nineveh as possible. And you see, Tarshish, they kind of have an idea of where Tarshish is. And so if we were to go to Jerusalem here, he went down to the sea and he got on a boat. We're going to fly by a plane. Oh, hang on. There we go. We're going to fly a plane across them. This is where he was going, and that's Gibraltar. And then from Gibraltar, they would go up the sea to this little right there. And in the desert there's a city. And that's approximately where he goes. Some maps a little bit different, but either way, it was in Spain. He was going as far as he could away from Nineveh in the opposite direction. He says, I'm out of here. I'm going to run as far as possible. And so Jonah runs away from God's calling on his life. But here's the thing that we need to grab a hold of this morning. Here's what we need to learn. You see, just because we stop pursuing God and even run away from it doesn't mean he stops pursuing us. I don't know if you've ever tried to run away from God, but when you do, you're going to find that you run to God. Somebody once said, every time you're running away from something, you're running to something. And when you run away from God, you soon realize that he's just waiting for you when you get there. God continues to pursue Jonah even as he runs away from God. Verse 4 says, God hurled a great wind upon the sea. There was a mighty tempest on the sea, so the ship was threatening to break up. You see, God wasn't punishing Jonah here. God was trying to get Jonah's attention. God knew Jonah was running away. He knew he was in the bottom of the boat. And he was essentially saying to Jonah, you may be running, but I'm not done with you yet. Maybe you're in the midst of a storm. There's many reasons for a storm, and I'm not going to say that every storm is because you're running from God. But sometimes it is. We run from God, and God says, I'm just going to let the pressure build and the storm build so that you run into that place where there's nowhere else to go. And you're going to run into me. And you're going to find that I'm in that situation. I'm allowing the storms. I'm allowing the waves to come up because you're about to come into a revelation of who I am that you haven't met yet. We see that in the New Testament with Jesus in the boat. Whether he's walking on the water or sleeping in the boat, in both of those stories, at the end of the day, the disciples come to that moment where they realize that God is even in the storm and he's greater than the storms. And in Jonah here, we discover that God allows the storms to come up so that Jonah would finally stop running and come face to face with God. And even when Jonah relented, here's the bad news, and gave in to God. We love to say God wiped the storm away, cleansed him, and sent him on to Nineveh, and everything was good to go, but there was consequences. You see, he was at sea, and he ended up in the sea. And as far as he and everybody figured, he was dead because he was thrown overboard. But you see, consequence was he ended up in the belly of a beast, a belly of a whale. But you see, the consequences don't have to have the final word. That's the good news. The good news is the bad news is there's consequences to decisions you make. Yes, Jesus forgives sins. Yes, he cleanses you. Yes, he enables your future. Yes, it's going to be good. But sometimes in the moment when we live certain ways, there are consequences to actions. I know where I'm going. But if I jump out of some crazy vehicle going at 100 kilometers an hour and live through it, I'm still going to heaven, but there's going to be consequences when I hit the pavement. And Jesus may choose to heal me, and that's great. But there's consequences to our actions. And Jonah had consequences. And here's the consequence. In verse 17, here's what it says. Now the Lord had arranged for a great fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. You see, God's not surprised by our rebellion. God's not taken back when we run away. He doesn't have to change his plans. He's kind of like, hey, you're running from me? Well, actually, you're running to me, and I've got something ordained and arranged for you. He's ready for it. And here he uses a fish, a beast, and people that are much smarter than me have wrestled with it. But here's what Jesus said about the fish, because Jesus quotes Jonah. Jesus quotes Jonah in Matthew 12, verse 41. Just as Jonah was in the belly of the great fish for 3 days and 3 nights, so the man of Son will be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. Literally, Jesus was saying Jonah went to hell. So if you think, Jonah was in that fish, for 3 days, and it was just a great time, and he had this, quiet time, and it was nice and quiet, and he had moments to pray. Jesus is saying, no, it was actually hell. He's comparing Jonah's 3 days with his 3 days, and he's making a reference and saying it's hell. It was not positive. It was not warm and fuzzy. It was not fun. There's actually a story about a man that was whaling, and he was actually swallowed by a whale, and he literally lived to tell the tale, because the short version of the story is they were whaling, and I don't know where they were, and it was many years ago, and they were in boats, and in the first boat they harpooned the whale, and then the second boat harpooned the whale, and in the process the boat got upset, and he ended up in the water, and he ended up in the whale. And then as they dragged the whale back and they were processing the whale the next day, they found him in the whale, and they rescued him. And yet the stomach juices were so strong in the whale that he had no hair on his body. It just dissolved it. He lived, but they say he had bleached his skin pure white. It was not a pleasant thing. And they quote his story, and he talks about it, and it's not a very pretty and good story. So it is possible. And it's very easy, because you see, God could make it happen. How he did it, we don't know, but it doesn't matter. But it was not a pleasant thing. And sometimes our consequences are not positive. They're not pleasant. And we cry out to God and we go, why did we end up here? What are you doing, God? And God is saying, I was prepared, but there's consequences to your action. But I am still there. You see, God is still pursuing us today. He's still pursuing us just as he pursues Jonah. Because you see, God has a plan and a heart for the nations. If we were to temporize it, God has a plan and a purpose for your neighbors, and he wants to use you. He wants to use us. Isaiah 53 verse 6 says, and we all like sheep have gone astray. We've turned each one to his own way. And even though we've turned from God, he's not turned from us. Just like he did with Jonah, God is still pursuing us. And he's still pursuing each one of us. Yes, he allows, sometimes he even places storms in our life to get our attention and to let us know that he hasn't gone anywhere. Even though we're running, he's still there. And even though when we turn back to him, sometimes the consequences are not positive, sometimes the consequences are horrible, God is still there. Because when we turn back to him, he has a plan and a purpose, and there's nothing that can get in the way. But you see, here's the deal. God is greater than the consequences. God is not surprised when we rebel. God is not surprised in what we do. He is there. And the choice we have is, are we going to let the consequences have the final word? Or do we say, you know what, I'm going to turn to God? There's a fantastic prayer where Jonah prays to God. Nothing like 3 days in a whale to refocus a guy's attention. He says this in chapter 2. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from inside the fish. Nothing like a fish to get your attention. And he says, I cried out to the Lord in my great trouble, and he answered me. I call out to you from the land of the dead, Lord, and you heard me. You threw me into the ocean depths, and I sank down into the heart of the sea. The mighty waters engulfed me. I was buried beneath your wild and stormy waves. Then I said, O Lord, you have driven me from your presence, and yet I looked once more towards your holy temple. I sank beneath the waves, the water closed over me, seaweed wrapped itself around my head, and I sank down to the very roots of the mountain. I was imprisoned in the earth, whose gates locked shut forever. But you, O Lord, snatched me from the jaws of death. As my life was slipping away, I remembered the Lord, and my earnest prayer came out to you in your holy temple, to those who worship the false gods, turning their backs on all of God's mercy. But I will offer sacrifice to you with songs of praise. I will fulfill all my vows, for my salvation comes from the Lord alone. Wherever you are this morning, God knows where you are. He sees you. And he has plans and purposes for you. And when we run to him, he can do anything. I love the last verse of chapter 2. Jonah has just given this great prayer. And it says, then the Lord ordered the fish to spit Jonah onto the beach. Sometimes we get spit. But God is in it. Wherever you find yourself in the circumstances, God is there. The message throughout Jonah is There's so many messages in Jonah. There's so many things that we could wrestle with. But one of the overarching themes is through it all, God is there and not surprised. And God's not surprised by you. God's not surprised. He has a plan and a purpose. He cares for his neighbors. He cares for the whole world, and he cares for you. And I love that phrase, whatever you're running from, you'll find you're running to something. And if you're running from God, you're going to find yourself running to God, because God was not surprised. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for Jonah. I thank you for that message of hope. I thank you that you were with Jonah. You had a plan and a purpose, and you cared for the Ninevites just as you cared for your people. You cared for all Gentiles, but you also cared for Jonah. And Lord, when he ran, you were not surprised. When we run, you're not surprised. And so, Father, I pray that each person here encounters you. And Lord, when they run away from you, Father, that they would run into you. Lord, that you would be revealed, that you would be glorified, and that you would be lifted up. We thank you for that this day. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.